This week, a friend of ours went to Broadway to buy tickets for a new musical. It's Les Miserables, and it opens in mid-March. Now, our friend was planning a spring evening at the theater, but he couldn't get choice seats. Instead, he got a voucher good for tickets next January. Now, even before it's open, Les Miserables has wowed Broadway with record advance ticket sales of over $10 million. And tonight, Bob Brown gives us a first look at this remarkable production. It's been playing in London for a year, and there, Bob got a front row seat.
The story of Les Miserables has been retold and copied countless times since the novel by Victor Hugo first appeared 125 years ago. Now, as a sellout musical in London, soon to open in New York, Bangkok, Sydney, Tokyo, it is, even by today's inflated standards, a hot property once again. This is one of the settings, a barricade defended by young revolutionaries in Paris who know they will soon die fighting.
Drink with me, 2 days gone by, sing with me the songs we knew at the shrine of friendship. Never say die, let the wine of friendship never run dry. Drink with me.
How did a 19th century French novel about faith and justice and humanity come to form the basis of a hit musical with record Broadway ticket sales?
First and foremost, it's one of the greatest tales that's ever been told by a master writer.
Cameron McIntosh hadn't even read the novel when he decided to produce the show, but like many of us, he'd been hooked by the story in other ways.
The story's already been made into over 25 movies. It's spawned one of the longest-running television series in American history, The Fugitive. It's virtually indestructible.
I didn't mean to steal. We were only hungry, I tell you, hungry! Hungry!
A starving man sentenced to years of hard labor merely for having stolen a loaf of bread. One of the definitions of injustice that we're taught from childhood. Les Miserables is the story that brought it to life. This 1935 film version featured Frederick March and Charles Laughton in the leading roles. Movie makers like the novel because it also has the appeal of the chase. The man who stole the bread, Jean Valjean, becomes a respected citizen under a new identity, but he is relentlessly tracked by a police inspector named Javert. That pursuit inspired television's The Fugitive. Ultimately, the leading characters are swept into the story of a revolutionary period in France, leading to a Paris uprising where a group of young idealists make their last stand at a street barricade. And so, up to and including this multi-million-dollar musical, Victor Hugo's story has displayed exceptional staying power.
Every nation can see their own personal struggle in it. There isn't a country in the world that doesn't have its own parallel in the story that Victor Hugo wrote.
What seemed odd was the idea of setting it to music. Here in Paris, where avenues and schools and statues are dedicated to Victor Hugo, he is a national hero, a man whose optimism was also larger than life, who believed the future would put an end to the war and despair he wrote about. He also specified before his death that none of his poems should ever be set to music, apparently overlooking the possibility that one of his books would be. A century after he died, 2 French songwriters, Alain Boublil and Claude Michel Schoenberg, adapted into a pop opera this story that they and most other French children had been raised on, despite the shadow of Victor Hugo.
It's looking for trouble, trying to take Les Miserables and transform it into a musical. So you know you will be told that's sacrilege. But we knew that we wanted to make something sincere, something true, and we knew that this book, like Claude Michel said before, was a written opera.
A production eventually was staged in Paris in a sports arena. The two songwriters were accused by some of sacrilege. But an album made from the music became a bestseller in France, and that eventually got into the right hands across the English Channel.
It's wonderful. It's got the scale of the show and everything like that. Yeah.
Cameron Mackintosh is one of the most successful theatrical producers in the world, backing shows that other producers might consider too unorthodox. His other hits include Cats and a new show in London that has sold out performances a year in advance, Phantom of the Opera.
Well, somebody came into my office and brought me this album, which was in French. It was Les Miserables. And as I listened to the score in French, it painted pictures. And I think really good theatre music has to do that.
This song came to symbolize the difficulties involved when the time finally came to set English lyrics to Schoenberg's music. In French, the lyrics to this melody had fit the central theme of the show.
You must have a basis, like when you build a house, you know? You must have your basis. So.
You could tell from the very beginning that this was a song for an unhappy part. I mean, it was a sad song, and it was a good start for a musical called Les Miserables.
The title in French was La Misère.
We had to invent a completely new idea for that song. It is really quite significantly different from what originally happened in Paris.
John Caird was one of the original members of the team assembled by Cameron Mackintosh to revamp the show for an English audience. He's now co-directing this New York cast. That song, sung by actress Frances Raffel, that was once La Misère, went through a transformation for the English production because of the differences in the way our languages sound.
La misère is simply the French word for poverty. But you can't sing poverty or poverty. It's just not singable.
So, without changing the plot of the show, some melodies were rearranged with lyrics that fit other characters in the story. La Misère became, in English, a lament titled On My Own.
Our casting director coined the title for the show of The Glums, which is not really fair because it's not a gloomy show. It's not a depressing show to watch. And there is quite a lot of laughter in it, but nonetheless, I think one of the main reasons why it's been so successful is because although it's a musical, it is that very rare thing, a serious musical.
Trevor Nunn is the co-director who staged the show with John Caird.
John and I approached the material exactly as we would approach a Shakespeare play or a play by Chekhov. Absolutely nothing and nobody is to be let off the hook because it's a musical.
In fact, the English production wound up being more than an hour longer than the original French production, adding scenes from the book that the French had felt were unstageable. For example, one of the most famous episodes in the story of Les Miserables occurs in one of the worst conceivable locations to stage a song, here in the sewers of Paris. Valjean enters the sewer system to find an avenue of escape, using his last reserve of strength to save the life of a wounded revolutionary his adopted daughter has fallen in love with. On stage, the scene is done by suggestion, with light and shadow and theatrical smoke. One of the most emotionally powerful moments in the show is a prayer Valjean sings, offering his life to God in exchange for the younger man's life. Schoenberg wrote it only weeks before the London opening to fit the extraordinary voice of the star who plays Valjean, Colm Wilkinson.
We were listening all to him, and we had the most amazing singer a musical company can have.
That's why I wrote a song with such such an incredible voice, so high.
In common with many composers, Claude Michel doesn't sing too good, and he doesn't play the piano too good. I mean,
he's made albums.
I know. But I mean, when
Don't let him hear you say that.
But we realized that he was onto a very wonderful idea. I mean, a song that would express something very religious, that would be prayerful.
And then came the day when Colm sang it to the company for the first time. Right suddenly, and out came this remarkable noise.
You can take, you can give, let him be, let him live. If I die, let me die.
And by the end of it, the company were completely stunned. They were absolutely silent. It was Trevor who said to everybody, well, that's the prayer. And I told you, he said, I told you that this show was all about God. And one of the actors said, yes, but you didn't tell us you'd engaged him to sing it.
Like the songs, the sets by designer John Napier have little to do with the glamour that's usually part of the formula of musical theater, but they are, in their own way, spectacular. This 3-ton computer-driven street barricade is so complex that a similar version, installed at the Kennedy Center in Washington, caused the cancellation of 2 performances when it broke down. But generally, bringing this show on to America has been the easiest part of the process. Only minor changes have been made in the music, and there's very little choreography to worry about. These are people who were hired more for their voices than for their agility. In fact, there's not even a choreographer credited to the show. Like an opera, Les Miserables has no spoken dialogue, not one big dance number. Caird relied on Francis Raffel's memory of the London production to set things back in sync for this rehearsal.
Don't let it be said that this show doesn't have choreography in it. Once more, please.
One day more, another day, another destiny, this never-ending road to Calvary.
This is the number that will become the showstopper when all the major characters, the fugitive Valjean, the police inspector Javert, the young lovers who'll soon be separated, the revolutionaries, wonder what their futures will bring.
One day more. Tomorrow.
The extraordinary thing about Hugo approaching the end of the century was that he felt impelled to embrace a surge of optimism. Hugo says, we may ask ourselves the question, will the future ever arrive? And he answers it emphatically. He says, despite all of the evidence to the contrary, that human spirit in which we place our optimism will survive and is in no more danger than a star in the jaws of the clouds.
Victor Hugo may have been naive in believing that the 20th century would see an end to war, but that faith in humanity is also why we return so often to the story he told.
I had the joy, as you did, Bob, of seeing this show in London with my husband, and it is worth waiting for tickets. It's the kind of show you can take the kids to, too, unless they're very young.
You're absolutely right. It's kind of, the audience didn't want to leave after the show was done.
But you know, it used to be that in this country, we were the originators of the musical. Now they're coming from London. Cats and Me and My Girl and Phantom of the Opera is coming here. It's changed.
Cameron McIntosh says a couple of the reasons are, number one, that it's much less expensive to produce a show in London now, and number two, the critics aren't as powerful there. Les Miserables got a lot of negative reviews when it opened, but it still built momentum in its run because of word of mouth.
And he can get killed in one night. Yeah, well, we toasted on Victor Hugo's birthday today. Thank you, Bob. When we come back, we'll be joined by Ted Koppel for the report by the Tower Committee.